December 8, 1941, 12:35 p.m. Philippines time. At Clark Field, the largest American air base in the Far East, ground crew service rows of B-17 flying fortresses parked wingtip to wingtip. Pilots and crews eat lunch in the mess hall. The morning has been tense. News of Pearl Harbor arrived hours ago. Aircraft were sent up on patrol, then recalled. Now, with no Japanese attack materializing, the base has relaxed slightly. Then, at 12:37 p.m., the sound changes. A distant rumble grows into thunder. Men look up to see the sky fill with aircraft, but these aren't friendly. 53 Japanese bombers approach in perfect formation at 20,000 feet. Below them, 51 Zero fighters sweep in at treetop level. Within minutes, Clark Field becomes an inferno. B-17s explode one after another as bombs find their marks. Parked in neat rows, they offer perfect targets. Fuel tanks rupture, spraying burning gasoline. Ammunition cooks off in spectacular explosions. Zeros strafe anything that moves: aircraft, vehicles, fleeing personnel. When the attack ends 45 minutes later, the devastation is total. 18 B-17s destroyed. Half of America's heavy bomber force in the Philippines wiped out on the ground. Dozens of P-40 fighters similarly destroyed. Over 80 Americans dead, 150 wounded. It's the worst single-day loss of American air power in history. Worse than Pearl Harbor in terms of aircraft destroyed. And it happens despite 8 hours of warning. This is the story of how America's most powerful bombers, aircraft designed to destroy enemy targets from 25,000 feet, became the most vulnerable when sitting on the ground. How preventable disasters kept recurring, and how painful lessons eventually forged the doctrine that protected these invaluable assets. To understand the disaster at Clark Field, we must understand what was lost and why it happened. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress represented the pinnacle of American air power in 1941. Four Wright R-18-20 engines, producing 1,200 horsepower each. Defensive armament of 13.50 caliber machine guns. Bomb load capacity of 4,500 pounds. Combat radius exceeding 1,000 miles. This bomber was designed to be invulnerable, operating at altitudes beyond the reach of most fighters, bristling with defensive guns, armored and self-sealing. By December 1941, the Philippines hosted 35 B-17s, the largest concentration of American heavy bombers outside the continental United States. This force represented a strategic deterrent, a tripwire meant to deter Japanese aggression. If war came, these bombers would strike Japanese bases, contest command of the air, and buy time for reinforcements. But on the morning of December 8th, December 7th in Hawaii, across the international date line, everything goes wrong. News of Pearl Harbor reaches the Philippines around 3 a.m. local time. Major General Louis Brereton, commanding Far East Air Force, immediately requests permission to launch preemptive strikes against Japanese airfields on Formosa, Taiwan. His B-17s could catch Japanese aircraft on the ground, potentially crippling their offensive capability. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters denies permission. The reasons remain debated, perhaps waiting for presidential authorization, perhaps fearing provocation, perhaps simple confusion in the chaotic early hours. Brereton requests permission multiple times through the morning. Each time he's told to wait. Meanwhile, Clark Field goes on alert. B-17s take off on patrol missions to avoid being caught on the ground. P-40 fighters fly combat air patrol overhead. The morning passes in tense waiting. Around 11 a.m., fog over Formosa begins lifting. Japanese bombers and fighters take off, forming up for the strike on the Philippines. American radar in the Philippines is primitive and unreliable, but does detect large formations approaching. However, the warning system breaks down. Messages fail to reach Clark Field in time. At approximately 11:30 a.m., the B-17s return from patrol, desperately low on fuel. They land and taxi to parking areas. Ground crews begin refueling. This is the most dangerous moment. Aircraft parked in neat rows, fuel trucks alongside, crews in the open. Simultaneously, the fighter patrol is recalled to refuel. The P-40s land just as the Japanese strike force approaches. At 12:15 p.m., pilots and crews head to lunch, believing the crisis has passed. If the Japanese were going to attack, surely they would have struck at dawn. 22 minutes later, the Japanese arrive. The attack unfolds with devastating precision. High-level bombers drop their loads from 20,000 feet beyond the range of Clark Field's anti-aircraft guns. The bombs fall in patterns across the neatly aligned B-17s. Explosions march down the flight line. Direct hits blast bombers apart. Near misses riddle aircraft with shrapnel. Zero fighters follow, strafing at low level. Their 20 cannon and 7.7 machine guns tear through thin aluminum skin. Fuel tanks rupture and ignite. Ammunition explodes. Personnel caught in the open are cut down. The Americans fight back desperately. Anti-aircraft guns engage, but their range is insufficient against the high-level bombers. A few P-40s manage to take off, but they're overwhelmed by numbers. Most are caught on the ground and destroyed. Captain Colin Kelly manages to get his B-17 airborne and actually bombs a Japanese warship, becoming one of America's first war heroes. But his feat is the exception. Most bombers never leave the ground. By 1:20 p.m., it's over. The Japanese retire with minimal losses, 7 aircraft. Behind them, Clark Field burns. Final tally: 18 B-17s destroyed, half the Philippines' force. 53 P-40 fighters destroyed, 25 additional aircraft damaged. Hangars, fuel storage, and infrastructure heavily damaged, 80-plus American personnel killed. The catastrophe is complete. America's primary deterrent in the Far East has been shattered in 45 minutes. And unlike Pearl Harbor, this disaster came with 8 hours of warning. The Clark Field disaster wasn't unique. Throughout early 1942, similar catastrophes repeated across the Pacific and would occur later in Europe. Understanding why requires examining the fundamental vulnerabilities. Problem 1. Concentration * military efficiency demands concentration. Aircraft need maintenance facilities, fuel supplies, ammunition stores, spare parts. Runways require extensive real estate. The logic pushes toward concentrating air power at a few large, well-equipped bases. But concentration creates vulnerability. Aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip present perfect targets. A single bomb can destroy multiple aircraft. Strafing runs can sweep entire flight lines. At Clark Field, B-17s were parked in neat rows for efficient ground handling. This organization made refueling and maintenance easier, and made destruction from the air devastatingly efficient. Problem 2. Warning time radar in 1941 to 42 was primitive by later standards. Detection ranges were limited. Identification was difficult. Are those incoming aircraft friendly or hostile? Communication systems were unreliable. The warning chain from radar operators to fighter controllers to airfield commanders often broke down. Even when warning arrived, response time was critical. Starting engines, taxiing, taking off, these processes took precious minutes. Aircraft caught during takeoff were even more vulnerable than those on the ground. Problem 3. Defensive armament limitations * anti-aircraft guns in 1941 to 42 had serious limitations. Heavy AA guns could reach high altitude but had slow rates of fire and required direct hits. Light AA guns could put up walls of fire but lacked the range to engage high-altitude bombers. Fire control systems were primitive. Radar-directed fire control, which would later prove devastating against aircraft, was in its infancy. Most AA fire relied on optical sights and manual tracking. Problem 4. Fighter protection combat air patrol sounds simple. Keep fighters airborne over your base at all times. Reality is more complex. Fighters have limited endurance. P-40s could patrol for perhaps 90 minutes before needing to refuel. Maintaining continuous coverage requires multiple flights rotating through patrol cycles. Fuel consumption makes continuous CAP expensive. Pilot fatigue accumulates. Mechanical failures increase with constant operations, and the moment fighters land to refuel, the base becomes vulnerable. Problem 5. Intelligence failures. Clark Field demonstrates catastrophic intelligence failure. The Japanese strike force took off from Formosa in daylight. They formed up over the ocean, visible to any observer. They flew hundreds of miles to their target. Yet American forces received no effective warning. Intelligence networks in 1941 to 42 were inadequate. Communication was slow. Analysis was limited. The signal-to-noise ratio, distinguishing real threats from false alarms, proved difficult. These 5 problems combined to create recurring disasters throughout 1942. In the Philippines, remaining B-17s retreated to Mindanao, then to Australia, constantly fleeing Japanese air attacks. By December 24th, only 17 B-17s remained operational in the entire theater. In Java, bombers staging through hastily prepared airfields faced constant Japanese air attack. Parked aircraft were sitting ducks. Maintenance facilities were bombed repeatedly. In North Africa, in early 1943, Luftwaffe attacks caught American bombers on the ground at multiple fields. The Germans possessed both the capability and doctrine for airfield attack, refined through years of war in Europe. The pattern repeated: concentration for efficiency, inadequate warning, insufficient defense, heavy losses. While Americans learned painful lessons in the Pacific, the threat in Europe proved even more sophisticated. The Luftwaffe had developed airfield attack into a refined art. From Poland to France to Russia, German fighters and bombers had perfected techniques for destroying enemy air power on the ground. The threat came in multiple forms. High-level bomber attacks could crater runways, destroy facilities, and hit parked aircraft with relative safety from ground fire. Asterisk low-level fighter bomber attacks maximized accuracy and surprise. FW-190s and BF-109s carrying bombs or equipped with gun pods could devastate parked aircraft. Night intruder operations targeted returning bombers as they prepared to land. Aircraft low on fuel, damaged, crew exhausted, most vulnerable. The Germans understood that destroying bombers on the ground was far more efficient than intercepting them in the air. One successful airfield attack could destroy dozens of bombers that would otherwise require hundreds of fighter sorties to shoot down. As 8th Air Force built up in England through 1942 to 43, the threat was clear. Bomber bases in East Anglia, Norfolk, Suffolk, Cambridgeshire were within range of German bases in France and Holland. Concentrated on relatively few airfields, the B-17 and B-24 force presented tempting targets. British experience provided cautionary lessons. During the Battle of Britain, Luftwaffe attacks on RAF fighter command airfields had come dangerously close to success. Only Hitler's decision to shift to terror bombing of London saved the fighter bases from destruction. American planners studied these lessons. If the Germans decided to systematically attack 8th Air Force bomber bases, the results could be catastrophic. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s parked on East Anglian airfields represented an enormous concentration of air power and vulnerability. The question became, how do you protect bombers on the ground from a determined enemy with local air superiority? Painful experience and careful planning gradually evolved protective doctrine. The solutions weren't revolutionary, but their implementation required resources, discipline, and constant vigilance. Solution 1. Dispersal. Instead of concentrating aircraft in neat rows, spread them out. Build revetments, earthen berms that protect individual aircraft. Create dispersed hardstands connected by taxiways. Make the flight line a poor target. British airfields in East Anglia implemented extensive dispersal. Each bomber had its own hardstand, often protected by earthen revetments or even concrete shelters. The aircraft might be 100 yards from its neighbors. A bomb that destroyed one aircraft wouldn't damage others. Dispersal had costs. Ground handling became more complex. Maintenance crews needed vehicles to move between aircraft. Fuel trucks drove longer distances. But the protection was worth the inefficiency. American bases in England eventually featured elaborate dispersal patterns. Aerial photos show bombers spread across huge airfields, each in its own protected position. The concentrated, target-rich environment of Clark Field was replaced by dispersed deployment. Solution 2. Early warning asterisk radar improved dramatically through the war. Britain's chain home system provided early warning of German raids. Fighter controllers could vector interceptors to incoming threats. Airfields received minutes of warning, enough time to scramble fighters or activate defenses. American-developed radar systems, particularly the SCR-270 and its successors, improved detection and tracking. Integration with fighter direction systems allowed coordinated defense. Communication systems improved. Direct telephone and radio links connected radar stations to fighter command to individual airfields. Warning time increased from minutes to tens of minutes. Solution 3. Active defense asterisk anti-aircraft protection around bomber bases increased exponentially. By 1944, major bomber bases in England bristled with AA guns, heavy 19 guns for high-altitude defense, automatic 14 Bofors guns for medium-altitude .50 caliber machine guns for low-level strafing defense. Barrage balloons to force attackers' higher fire control improved dramatically. Radar-directed fire control systems, particularly the SCR-584 fire control radar paired with proximity-fused ammunition, proved devastatingly effective. By 1944, AA guns could track and engage targets far more effectively than in 1941. Solution 4. Fighter protection. Fighter bases located near bomber bases provided mutual protection. If German fighters attacked bomber bases, Allied fighters could intercept from nearby fields. The integrated defense system meant attackers faced both AA fire and fighter interception. By 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost air superiority over Western Europe. German daylight attacks on Allied airfields became suicidal. The few raids attempted were intercepted and decimated. Night attacks remained a threat. RAF night fighters, Beaufighters and Mosquitoes equipped with radar, hunted German intruders. The night skies over England became deadly for German aircraft. Solution 5. Deception and decoys asterisk dummy airfields with fake aircraft drew German attacks. From the air, these decoys looked realistic. Proper runway patterns, taxiways, dispersed hardstands, and dummy bombers made of wood and canvas. German reconnaissance would photograph these fields, intelligence would identify them as targets, and strikes would waste bombs on empty fields while real bases remained untouched. Camouflage improved. Aircraft were painted to blend with backgrounds. Parking areas were camouflaged to break up recognizable patterns. Deceptive lighting could make dummy fields appear active while real fields remained dark. Despite improved doctrine, catastrophes still occurred when fundamentals were neglected. Operation Bodenplatte, January 1, 1945, New Year's Day 1945. The Luftwaffe launches its last major offensive operation, a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields in Belgium, Holland, and France. Over 1,000 German fighters and fighter bombers strike at dawn, targeting Allied tactical air forces supporting ground operations. The operation achieves complete surprise. Allied forces, celebrating New Year's Eve, are caught unprepared. German fighters strafe dozens of airfields simultaneously. Results are mixed but significant. 144 Allied aircraft destroyed on the ground, 84 Allied aircraft damaged. However, the Luftwaffe loses 237 aircraft and, crucially, 237 irreplaceable pilots. The Allies replace their losses within days. The Germans never recover. Bodenplatte becomes a Pyrrhic victory, tactical success, but strategic disaster. The operation demonstrates that even late in the war, aircraft caught on the ground remain vulnerable. But it also shows that effective defensive measures, dispersal, AA protection, rapid response, limit damage, and inflict unacceptable costs on attackers. Pacific Theater. Ongoing vulnerability in the Pacific. American bombers operating from forward island bases, remained vulnerable throughout the war. Japanese night raids on B-29 bases in the Marianas caused persistent problems. Iwo Jima and Saipan, hosting hundreds of B-29s, faced regular Japanese attacks. While losses were never catastrophic on the scale of Clark Field, the constant threat required extensive defensive measures. Night fighter patrols, radar-directed searchlights, dense AA coverage dispersed parking. Rapid damage, repair the vulnerability persisted because forward bases lacked the infrastructure and defense in depth of rear area facilities. But improved doctrine and resources prevented disasters. Examining how different air forces protected bombers on the ground reveals interesting contrasts. German Luftwaffe. The Germans pioneered airfield attack doctrine but struggled to protect their own bases as the war turned against them. By 1944 to 45, Luftwaffe airfields faced constant Allied attack. German responses included extensive dispersal and camouflage underground and hardened facilities, fake airfields, dense AA protection, but these measures proved insufficient against overwhelming Allied air superiority. By late 1944, German bombers were being destroyed faster on the ground than they could be produced. British RAF, British experience during the Battle of Britain created sophisticated airfield defense doctrine. RAF bomber bases featured decoy airfields that drew German attacks, extensive dispersal patterns, rapid runway repair capabilities, integrated fighter and AA defense. RAF Bomber Command suffered relatively few losses to ground attack. The majority of losses came from operational accidents and enemy action over Germany. Soviet Air Force. The Soviets learned brutal lessons in 1941 when Operation Barbarossa destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground in the war's opening days. The catastrophe rivaled Clark Field in scale but exceeded it in totality. Soviet responses emphasized radical dispersal, often into forests, mobile, austere operations, rapid relocation, accepting primitive conditions for security. By 1943 to 44, Soviet air power operated from crude forward airfields that offered little comfort but much security through dispersal and mobility. Japanese defensive doctrine never adequately addressed the vulnerability of aircraft on the ground. By 1944 to 45, American air attacks systematically destroyed Japanese air power at island bases. The Japanese attempted dispersal and camouflage, but lacked the resources and infrastructure for truly effective protection. Aircraft hidden in jungle clearings or dispersed to crude strips often couldn't operate effectively even if they survived attack. By war's end, the lessons were clear and had been written in the wreckage of thousands of aircraft. Lesson 1. Dispersal is survival, concentration equals vulnerability. Aircraft must be dispersed to survive. The efficiency losses are acceptable compared to the cost of catastrophic destruction. Modern air bases feature extensive dispersal. Hardened shelters protect individual aircraft. Underground facilities safeguard critical operations. The neat rows of Clark Field are historical curiosities. Lesson 2. Warning time is critical. Early detection allows response. Radar, communication systems, and integrated command structures provide the warning time needed to activate defenses or evacuate aircraft. Modern air defense networks detect threats at hundreds of miles range. Warning time is measured in hours, not minutes. Decision cycles accelerate, but detection remains paramount. Lesson 3. Active defense must be multi-layered. Relying on a single defensive measure invites failure. Effective defense requires early warning systems, fighter interceptors, surface-to-air missiles, the evolution of AA guns, point defense systems, electronic warfare and deception, hardened facilities, rapid repair capabilities. Lesson 4. Air superiority is the ultimate protection. When you control the air, your bases are safe. The Allies achieved this over Western Europe by 1944. The Luftwaffe could barely contest Allied air superiority, making sustained attacks on Allied airfields suicidal. Conversely, When the enemy controls the air, no defensive measures fully protect grounded aircraft. The Japanese discovered this in 1944 to 45 as American air power destroyed their remaining forces. Lesson 5. Complacency kills. Clark Field had 8 hours of warning. Bodenplatte caught celebrating troops off guard. The pattern repeats. When vigilance lapses, disasters occur. Modern air forces maintain constant alert status at bases in threatened areas. The peacetime efficiency that clusters aircraft in neat rows disappears instantly when threat levels rise. December 8, 1941, at Clark Field represents a nadir in American air power. The worst single-day loss, a catastrophe that should have been prevented, a disaster that provided harsh lessons. But those lessons weren't wasted. The doctrine that evolved through WWII, dispersal, early warning, multi-layered defense, constant vigilance, became standard practice. Modern air bases reflect these hard-won lessons in every aspect of their design and operation. Consider a modern American air base in a potential conflict zone. Aircraft are dispersed in hardened shelters, concrete and steel structures that can withstand nearby bomb hits. Radar provides detection at hundreds of miles. Surface-to-air missiles offer multiple layers of defense. Fighter alert aircraft can launch within minutes. Electronic warfare systems confuse and deceive attackers. Rapid runway repair capabilities ensure operations continue despite damage. The neat rows of Clark Field are gone, replaced by dispersed hardstands and protective infrastructure. The surprise that caught bombers refueling is prevented by layered early warning. The helplessness of inadequate defenses is answered by integrated defensive systems. Yet the fundamental vulnerability remains. Aircraft on the ground cannot dodge. They cannot defend themselves. They remain stationary targets waiting to be destroyed. Modern precision-guided munitions make ground attack even more devastating than in WWII. A single missile can destroy a hardened shelter and the aircraft inside. Cruise missiles can strike from hundreds of miles away. The threat has evolved even as defensive measures improved. This is why air forces still obsess over base defense, why billions are spent on early warning systems, defensive weapons, hardened facilities, why doctrines emphasize dispersal, mobility, and rapid response. The ghost of Clark Field haunts every air commander who parks valuable aircraft on the ground. Those 18 B-17s, destroyed in 45 minutes, represent more than a historical footnote. They're a permanent reminder that the most powerful bomber in the sky becomes the most vulnerable target on the ground. The lessons learned in fire and wreckage between 1941 and 1945 remain relevant today. They shape how air forces operate, where they locate bases, how they protect assets. Modern air power rests on the foundation built from these painful lessons. And every time an Air Force planner designs a new base, disperses aircraft across hardstands, or activates early warning systems, they're applying lessons first learned in the flames of Clark Field on December 8, 1941. The most expensive aircraft ever built remains vulnerable when it sits on the ground. That simple truth, demonstrated so catastrophically at Clark Field and repeated across the war, remains as valid today as it was 80 years ago. This is how doctrine evolves, not from theory, but from disaster, not from planning, but from failure. The neat rows at Clark Field taught a lesson written in fire. Aircraft caught on the ground are aircraft destroyed. Modern air power ensures that lesson is never forgotten.